Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Finance and Accounting in a Post-Pandemic World. My name is Ty, and I will be your facilitator for today's event. This webinar is being presented by CFO Daily News and sponsored by Auditoria. Just a little housekeeping before we get started. If you have any questions during the presentation, please type them into the chat box in the control panel. If they're regarding the subject being presented, I'll add them to the queue for questions at the end. I'd like to welcome today's panel, Tyler, Surinder, and Ray, and introduce your moderator, Nick Uzzo. Nick, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Ty, and thanks everyone for being here. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where in the world you're calling in from. My name is Nick Uzzo. I'm the Vice President of Marketing for Auditoria, and you are on our webcast, Strategic Finance and Accounting in a Post-Pandemic World, how the past 12 months impact risk, mitigation, strategy, and more. So let's just jump right on into it. Well, anybody who lived through 2020 knows that change is the only constant. And corporate finance and accounting teams experienced more than their share of change in 2020. So before we get into the panel, let's dig into a couple of stats to sort of frame the problem, what we experienced in the last year. So in the last 100 years, since 1919, there have been 9 pandemics. And the one we're currently in right now, which is COVID-19, has claimed the lives of 2.2 million people so far as of February 1st, 2020. To see how that stacks up against other pandemics, it's not the worst, but it's also not the best. So the Spanish flu claimed over 40 million lives worldwide, and the HIV/AIDS crisis, which has been going on since 1981, has presented a real challenge in terms of economic impact. So this is where we stack up in terms of pandemics. Now, last year, what we experienced was, I'm going to try not to use the word unprecedented, and I'm surely going to try not to use the words new normal, but it's something we'd never experienced before. On December 31st, 2019, the first case of COVID-19 was reported to the World Health Organization. Shortly after that, the World Health Organization declared a global public health emergency, and the United States soon followed. In February, the markets experienced their worst day in nearly 2 years as the Dow Jones Industrial Average plunged dramatically. On March 16th of last year, California, my home state and the home of many technology companies, issued what was called the shelter-in-place or stay-at-home order, relegating most people to their homes and closing down many non-essential businesses. That same month, the Senate passed the CARES Act to try to keep the economy afloat and try to minimize the impact. In April and May, the government created the gating criteria to emerge as a way to reopen the economy as different gates or prerequisites were crossed. That quickly reversed itself as states in July reversed the reopening plans because of outbreaks that were caused by 4th of July, Memorial Day, later on Labor Day, Thanksgiving, and Christmas. We saw surges in COVID-19 during all those times. In August of last year, a more contagious strain of COVID-19 was discovered, and since then we've seen variants from Brazil, South America, specifically Brazil, South Africa, and the UK. In November last year, Pfizer published their vaccine results, and then the Food and Drug Administration agreed to an emergency use authorization for both the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines for COVID treatment. And today, as we sit here on this webcast in February 21, vaccinations are continuing to the pace of about 40 million Americans have received shots, at least a first shot in the arm. So that's kind of a look back at where we were and what happened last year. So in terms of unpredictability, the National Bureau of Economic Research determined that a peak in monthly activity occurred in the US economy in February 2020, marking the end of the longest recorded US expansion that began back in June of 2009. So the chart up above shows the percent difference in real inflation-adjusted gross domestic product, or GDP, from the peak of the business cycle through the quarter when the GDP returned to the level of the previous business. So for illustrative purposes, these are all the recessions in the last 30, 40 years since 1980. The most recent recession, the 2007 through 2009 housing crisis, caused the GDP to drop over a period of 18 months and then slowly recover over a period of 42 months. Contrast that with the recession last year, in which the steepest drop in economic output on record, 9.1% in the second quarter, 9.1% in the second quarter. To put this contraction into historical perspective, let me go back. Into historical perspective, the quarterly GDP had never experienced a drop greater than 3 percentage points since the record keeping began in 1947. But the COVID-19 crisis did not limit itself to impact on GDP. The COVID-19 crisis also led to dramatic swings in household spending. Retail sales, which primarily tracks the sales of consumer goods, declined 8.1% from February to March in 2020, the largest month-to-month decrease since the Census Bureau started tracking this data. Although some areas like grocery stores, pharmacies, and non-retailers saw increases in demand as lockdown measures began, others like clothing stores, furniture, appliances, food services, bars and pubs, sporting and hobby stores, and gas stations saw declines. In early May, as some states lifted their social distancing restrictions, some sales began to recover in most goods sectors. But overall, US retail sales increased 17.7% from April to May, the largest monthly jump on record. So what you can see here is, again, if we contrast this with the 2007 to 2009 recession, you see this sort of steep decline over an 18-month period and then a slow, steady recovery over the next 5 years. We've never seen anything like this before, but last year during COVID, in the first 3 months, we literally it dropped to 21 basis points below the peak. So if everything's starting at zero, we dropped 21% in terms of retail sales, and then shot back up in the next 3-month period, even exceeding the peak that had occurred just 6 months prior. So to put those swings in historical context, there's never been a swing that dramatically in the retail sector. So what kind of industries have been negatively affected by COVID-19? Well, it's typically, the ones we've all seen and heard about. So it's the hospitality industry, airlines, hotels, casinos and gaming, theme parks. So the hospitality industry has been pummeled during the COVID-19 crisis. And then, anything that has in-person components like gyms, movie theaters, restaurants, retail, construction, they saw a negative impact. And then, of course, auto parts and automakers, because of the demand, people were staying home. They didn't see the level of sales that they had experienced in previous years. So now let's look at the flip side of that and which companies, which types of companies, which sectors actually thrived last year during COVID-19. Cleaning services was one that was early on. As fears about the coronavirus spread, professional cleaners were in high demand to sanitize restaurants, offices, commercial buildings, and public spaces. Other businesses like delivery services, as people were at home and they couldn't go out, saw an uptick in their growth. Grubhub, DoorDash, Uber Eats, Costco, Instacart, all these companies saw a huge increase in their annual sales. Fitness equipment manufacturers like Peloton saw their sales go through the roof because people couldn't go to the gym. Likewise, as people couldn't go to restaurants or pubs, grocery stores and liquor stores saw an uptick in retail sales. So, and then last but not least, remote services like telehealth services, tutoring services, home healthcare providers. These things all became very, very important during the 2020 pandemic. And then finally, as the used car market, as people shied away from public transportation because they deemed it to be risky, and they didn't want to invest in a high interest rate for a new car, compounded by the fact that new car inventory was down, the used car market actually saw an uptick in 2020. So many companies pulled their guidance, and by guidance I mean their profit and sales guidance, in the early days of COVID-19. So in the S&P 500, 106 companies in the S&P 500 provided earnings guidance during the first quarter of 2020, down dramatically when the vast majority of publicly traded companies provide guidance to the street. So that number declined to 62 by the third quarter, according to FactSet. And in our most recent quarter, 87 companies in the index have provided guidance for the first quarter of 2021. And we'll get more into that as we move into the panel. So the economic forecast was kind of grim last year. The International Monetary Fund predicted in the beginning of the pandemic that the global economy would shrink by 3% in 2020, a downgrade of 6.3 percentage points from the estimates earlier in the year. The fund also estimated that over the first 2 years of the pandemic, economic losses could reach up to $9 trillion. Now, they made that prediction in April. In October, they went back and reevaluated that, and they said that losses over a 5-year period from 2020 to 2025 could reach as high as $28 trillion. And then the International Labor Organization estimated that 6.7% of working hours globally would be wiped out. That's the equivalent of 195 million full-time workers. Also an interesting stat is that the Chinese economy shrank 6.8% in the first 3 months of 2020, the country's first such contraction on record. But there is still cause for optimism. Executives maintain a positive outlook on the economy, though their views have tempered. So in this graph, you can see on the left, these finance executives and business executives responded about their home countries and what they thought the economic changes would be in the next 6 months. On the right side, these executives, these business executives, give their perspective on how the global economy will change in the next 6 months. And as you can see, there's a pretty positive outlook. Most executives believe that there's good news on the horizon. There's a better outlook coming in the next 6 months, although that is tempered slightly from 63% positive between November 30th and December 4th to a drop to 56% in mid-January. So there is a feeling of positivity about the economy as companies are plotting their exit from the pandemic and more. So last but not least, let's talk about some of the technology trends that were illustrated very early on in the COVID-19 pandemic. So according to Gartner, COVID-19 pandemic showed that companies that had an applied digital strategy were more resilient. And then on the right-hand side, you can see 10 technology trends to watch. The ones that I've highlighted in bold and green are the ones that I consider to be B2B, so instead of B2C. So digital payments, remote work, supply chain 4.0, and robotics and drones all became much more important according to the World Economic Forum. So that's a little bit of context and backdrop for our panel, and hopefully that was hopefully it was a good look at what we experienced, a very realistic look at what we experienced in 2020. So without further adu, I'd like to bring the panel in. So first of all, I'd like to introduce Ray Langham. Ray currently serves as the CFO of InContact since 2017. He also serves on boards of directors and has served in other executive finance positions at Access Data, Ivanti, Omcor, Bohr, Longyear, On Semiconductor, and Intuit. Ray started at Ernst & Young early on in his career in San Jose. He graduated from Fresno State University in Fresno, California with a bachelor's degree in accounting, where he was also a varsity member of the football team. So welcome, Ray. All right, next. Great to have you, Ray. So next up, Tyler Sloat. Tyler has more than 25 years of experience in finance and operations roles in SaaS, hardware, software companies, technology companies, varying in size from startups to the Fortune 500. Tyler joined Freshworks during the pandemic in 2020, and he brings a strong performance record, financial acumen, and strategic insight. Tyler is a registered CPA in the state of California with an MBA from Stanford Graduate School of Business and a BA from Boston College. He has served on the board of directors at Oanda and Compass Professional Health Services. So welcome, Tyler Sloat.
Thanks, Nick.
Last but not least, we've got our CFO part of the panel, but I'm very pleased to introduce Surinder Thin, who is an SVP and Equity Research Analyst at Jefferies. So he's been at Jefferies for a number of years. He's got more than 20 years of experience assisting corporate executives with their financial strategy and their operations. He specializes in equity research, financial modeling, risk management strategy, quantitative analysis, and more. He joined Jefferies in 2009 after successful stints at Deloitte and CGI. He's got an MBA in finance from the Wharton School, a master's degree in biomedical engineering from Case Western Reserve in Cleveland, Ohio, and a bachelor's degree in engineering physics from the University of Alberta. He holds a certification from CFA Institute, a global community of more than 145,000 investment professionals. So welcome, Surinder.
Thank you, Nick.
All right, so let's go to the panel. First up, I'd like to ask Ray. The first question, Ray, given your current situation at NICE InContact or other, you talked to a lot of CFOs, you're very well connected to the CFO community in Utah. What steps have you taken, your company taken, or other companies, what are companies doing to survive during the pandemic?
Yeah, I think the first thing everyone is doing is trying to understand their revenue flow and how it's going to be affected, how it was affected, how it's going to be affected in the future. And then based upon that revenue flow, then you can make the necessary adjustments from an expense perspective. So for us, we were able to go deeper into our revenue of predictive measures, going back into the marketing pipeline, understanding how that is being impacted, the different stages of pipeline, and be able to then help predict better the revenue side. So we've done a lot on the revenue side.
So Tyler, same question to you. What has Freshworks and other companies that you've been involved with, companies you may have served on the board, what are they doing to survive during this pandemic?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Ray. I mean, predictability is an issue, and we can talk about that. I think survival is interesting, right? Because it's really, how do you operate? And now we're in this whole new world. So it's really, an immediate shift to working from home, which impacted different places that we have people differently. We're a global company. We have a couple thousand people down in India. a lot of people over in Europe and a lot of people here in North America. And so number one, just figuring out how to make sure we are equipped with the technologies and everything else to be able to communicate and get our jobs done. Figuring out from a revenue perspective, predictability, but even before that, if you were selling both online and direct, how to remove friction in that process, but on the direct side, how to shift to, what a minute maybe was more of an true enterprise sale to something that's going to feel more like an inside sale because everything, is Zoom enabled. And so just making a lot of adjustments through that whole process. At the same time, really looking at expense and looking at revenue, and taking the one that's the least predictable in that case, which is probably bookings going into it, and then managing the one that was the most predictable, which is really hiring and what's going out. And so, like Ray said, we did a lot of work around that and kind of reshifted a lot of things.
Yeah, I would emphasize what he's saying is that once you understand sort of what that revenue is coming in, you make those adjustments from an expense perspective. So, we paused hiring, as Tyler said, and we've done some other things from an expense perspective early on. And obviously not being in the office, we haven't been in the office now for 11 months. And we too are a global company with people across the world, and we're all in our homes these days. So there is that pause of uncertainty, and then once you now have your model and you've seen how it works out, then you can hire more people, potentially let some expense go. But the first reaction was obviously sink back and pause on that expense side.
Yeah, very interesting that you got the cash flow coming in, you got the cash going out. You can definitely manage the cash going out. You can delay payments, but getting that cash in the door is always going to be a challenge, particularly during the pandemic. So, Surinder, you get the last word on this one. What the companies that you've been working with or evaluating at Jefferies, what steps are companies taking to survive during this pandemic?
So I think when I take a step back, there was a bit of a dual track approach, right? One was trying to understand where the employees were, what they were doing, and could they actually continue, right? There's the internal operations side of things, but then there's also the delivery side. So the first thing that kind of needed to be addressed from our perspective was, are you actually going to be able to deliver your services? So for example, there were outsourcing firms out there that if you relied on an outsourcer and that outsourcing firm was in India, they still needed to be able to deliver services. But what the Indian government did, for example, was they literally turned everything off. And so when those businesses are built around like these big data centers and you couldn't go in, there was literally clients that had lost service or their service providers overnight. And so if you're one of those companies, there was just this scramble to understand or build the capability for your employees to, what I would call, just work remotely. Right. And so part of that being able to work remotely was then, okay, can I actually operationally get my firm there? And that was the first part of it, just the nuts and bolts of it. And then the second part that we were looking for was the actual delivery of those capabilities, right? Because if you're used to working in a certain environment and all of a sudden you're doing face-to-face meetings or you're flying somewhere, that also got impacted. And so those were kind of the first parts of it, is what is the firm actually doing to actually what I would call is mitigate the downside or just literally survive. And it was only after that point that we started focusing on other elements of the game.
In your estimation, at what point did we reach that point last year? Was it in the first 3 months? Did it take 6 months? Did it take 9 months? When did we finally, when did things sort of settle down and shake out in your estimation?
So it depended on, it was firm to firm to a large extent. There was firms that if you were to think of somebody like a firm that maybe works globally, right? That they do a lot of their development offshore. They've got a lot of those capabilities. Now, if you're in, like I said, I'll go back to the data centers in India, there's a problem there. But if you're maybe outsourcing in a different part of the world, your workforce is already used to it. So there wasn't a lot there. It was just, they've already had the work, they already had the equipment, they took their laptop homes, and it was just about making sure they had upgraded internet connections and stuff. But there was other instances where it became just really difficult and you were just trying to assess what can we do. I mean, when there was a pause on business travel, Well, all of a sudden, if you're an investment banker, you're not used to doing business this way. And so, those kinds of things happened. We also saw things like pauses in the M&A pipeline. A lot of deals just kind of came to a standstill. So it was across the spectrum, and it was really industry specific.
I would say from our perspective, I mean, everyone has sort of a business connectivity plan, and we got to exercise that a little bit with this, and there was holes, right? I mean, everyone was scrambling around a little bit, like Surinder said, and for us, it took us probably a week, which I think was extremely fast. To all of a sudden put everybody at home, all the connectivities to all the, the demand. We already had people that work from home, but it wasn't all 2,000 of our employees. And so we had to, bring in some more equipment, put some bigger pipes of networking through there. And it took us about a week for that step to happen. And we did have outsourced, glitch like Surinder was talking about, and we had to make some adjustments very quickly, but we were able to do so in a matter of days.
Yeah, and I'll add to that. Is from the investment community's perspective, we were actually quite impressed at the ability of the vast majority of firms to respond. Had you run that scenario theoretically, a month or 2 months before, and you would have said, hey, this is going to happen, and all of a sudden all these problems are going to, how quickly do you think you can transition to a remote workforce? And nobody would have said company A is going to do it within 24 hours, company B is going to do it within 3 days, and company C is going to do it in 7 weeks. There was very few, I mean, there were definitely hiccups, and some companies did take, lost let's say 5% of their capabilities, and it took them about 6 to 8 weeks to get those capabilities back. But that wasn't that was the exception and not the norm.
Yeah. Many people call the COVID-19 pandemic a black swan event, or some people call it a gray swan event because it was, not entirely unpredictable. But as I showed on that chart of the 9 pandemics of the last 100 years, we will have another one. It's not a matter of if, it's when. And so I think it's important that companies have kind of gone through this process right now. We've been through it once, and the next time something happens, I think we'll definitely be better suited to adapt. Before we move to the next question, I want to remind everyone, if you have questions that you want to ask the panel, please put them in the question box in your WebEx or your GoToMeeting platform. So just fill something in the question box, and at the end, Ty will come back on, and we'll take some of the audience questions. So let's go back to Surinder for a quick second and talk about predictability. So I had a slide up there earlier that said uncertainty. Companies have pulled guidance. Are companies reinstating? Are they reinstating guidance? Are they going back to it? How do you think about this stuff, Surinder, in terms of getting guidance from companies about their performance?
Absolutely. I think when we take a step back to the early days of the pandemic, almost universally, everybody pulled guidance. I mean, visibility was completely gone, right? When you're trying to just figure out whether you can even deliver a service, and at the same time, you don't even know if your clients are going to be there tomorrow, right? There was, I don't want to say there was zero visibility, but for even firms that had highly reoccurring revenue models, or they thought that they had great visibility into the pipeline, the pipelines were just being slashed. And so visibility, very, very poor. And so guidance was generally pulled. Once people started, or some of the companies started getting a handle on things, the ones that had perhaps better tools, better technologies, better data, they started to kind of last quarter, the quarter before, introduce guidance, but it was more gradual in the sense that they were talking about visibility maybe a quarter out, whereas maybe they were doing that prior, for the full year and stuff. And then more recently, in the current round of earnings, a lot of companies have now started to reinstate full year guidance. And so they're getting comfortable enough that they think they have a good handle on where things are. We've now passed the vaccine stage where people kind of understand the end game, and they also understand the reaction function, which they didn't understand before. But that said, guidance is now still, the visibility level isn't quite all the way back yet. And so when we look at guidance, the bandwidths are a little bit wider from that we're receiving from the CFOs of the world.
Yeah, Ray, what are your thoughts on that, on the predictability and your ability to kind of see into the future?
Yeah, it's tough. I mean, we're a cloud software business, so we have a lot more visibility for that than probably a lot of other companies. It's sort of a monthly subscription run rate, if you will. So we're paying very close attention to customer attrition. Obviously, Tyler mentioned about bookings and those new potential revenue streams that will come on our books, and whether we reach our goals or not from a budget perspective, and then the variance and what does that mean to future revenue. So we're paying very close attention, more than we've ever had before, and spending a lot more hours going through all that data and parsing through it. But for us, we have a lot of predictability, which is good.
That's actually very good. Very lucky you've got the instrumentation in place to kind of see what's happening out there. Tyler, same question to you.
Yeah, I think Ray and Surinder mentioned it. So I joined in April, kind of right in the start of the pandemic, and I had already been talking to the management team, and we put some stuff in place pretty early, which is more around kind of slowing down hiring. I know that we never put a full pause in, but we slowed it down, because the first thing you can control is OpEx, right? You can control cash too, but cash is about in and out. You can control the out, not always the in. But on the OpEx side, you can. So hiring's the biggest. We also got a benefit throughout the year, I think everybody did, on marketing spend and travel spend, right? We also looked at real estate, and we tried to drop offices where we could, right? And that's a lot of like the WeWork spaces and things like that, knowing that now you can go get an office anywhere if you want to, right? And that was going to be pretty predictable. So getting out of that stuff. The thing that we didn't know going in, the predictability on our ARR growth, right? So we're a cloud software company. We have 3 products, Freshdesk, Freshservice, and Freshcrm. And been growing pretty fast. What we've been saying, we ended the year at over 300 million, and still were able to achieve a 40% growth rate. With that growth though, right, the in is really, really important to maintain growth. So we have a stable base, and I don't even want to say stable, because we also have churn and then booking. So the thing that was the hardest was really looking at ARR growth, and we try to run a subscription model where we invest after we hit an ARR goal, and that was the hardest part. Now, like Q2 bookings were okay, but churn was the thing that impacted, and some of it was actually self-inflicted, right? So we did, like, quote unquote, right by the customer. We gave out a lot of concessions, and the most unpredictable thing was whether those companies were going to be able to come out of a period of kind of trouble and being able to start paying their bills again and things like that, right? So if a customer said, hey, we're in trouble, we actually proactively gave them a concession. We definitely had customers who just disappeared, right? Like, these are even some big customers that are in the hospitality or travel segment, and they just don't exist anymore. There's like public companies that don't exist anymore. But we also got tailwinds, right, of customers switching to us because we are first a very digital first solution, so you can get on board and turn on really quickly, and moving away from these solutions that you kind of had to be in your office to use. And so that was completely unpredictable. So Q2 was kind of a quarter where we didn't know, and if we were public, we would have done what everybody else did, was pull guidance, right? Q3 we came out of it, we started to see it, and then Q4 we did even better. What Surinder says, like, companies are coming back and getting comfortable, but like the public company CFOs, which it would have been tough to be a public company CFO for all of last year, it really would have been. And so I kind of I smile every once in a while, even though you have different challenges at a private company. But I think the guidance ranges are bigger now, right? Because they're like, we're getting guidance, but they're putting out bigger ranges because there's still not a ton of certainty out there. And it's also a scarier thing, which is really weird in the market, is that specifically for SaaS, anybody growing, like you look at valuations, you have no idea there was a pandemic last year, right? Quite the opposite, actually. It feels like things have skyrocketed, and that means expectations are really high as well. So it's this weird dichotomy that's happening.
But just, Tyler, let me ask you a question about the visibility and stuff. How do you think about visibility for new business, though? Like, I understand in the subscription model, right? That's part of why you saw tech outperform, and especially subscription-based companies, because the reoccurring revenues, at least you kind of know what the floor might be, right? But what about the future? Because a big chunk of valuation also comes from your ability to bring in new customers in the door and grow the ARR on a.
Well, it's all about that. So you can look at a portion of your new ACV, your annual contract value, is going to come from upsell, and so that gets more predictable over time as of your base. But it's really about, as you said, sort of your new customers coming in. For us, it's a little bit more challenging. We have 2 go-to-market models, really 3 go-to-market models, but 2 mainly, inbound and outbound. The inbound is like all web-based. And this is like, we can spend money on Google AdWords, but then you gotta get like, how many people are converting from a click-through to hit your website, how many people start a trial, how many convert off that trial. But that's only like a 30-day process, right? So you only have about 30 days of visibility there. And then we have a traditional field that is like building pipeline and looking at your pipeline through stages, and then as they convert. And look, for any software company, that's the hardest thing, right? If you can get to really predictable on your ARR, then you're gonna do well. We put in place, kind of plan, outlook, forecast, cadence. And the outlook is essentially, calling a number at the beginning of the quarter and then measuring yourself to how accurate you can be at the end of the quarter, right? And we do it probably across 5 different elements of the business. ARR is one of them. That's the hardest, but revenue is actually pretty easy. OpEx is, you got a little bit of a wider margin, billings and cash flow. And so when you look at all those things, the whole goal is, can you get to these ranges on predictability, at the very beginning of the quarter, what you end up at the end of the quarter on.
So let's stick on that cash performance thread that you mentioned. So you have 5 factors that you guys are measuring, and one of them is cash. So how do your companies optimize and manage cash performance in the new normal? I said I was going to say it, but new normal. How are we managing cash, Tyler?
Yeah, I mean, it's well, look, so again, the out is the easiest part, right? So you have your recurring kind of expense, which is like headcount. You got to think about the inverse of recurring revenue. When you add headcount, it's like recurring expense, right? And that's pretty easy. Then you have a lot of like one-time expense, which is your marketing events are typically one of the biggest things. And then they're not one time, but recurring is also your COGS element and what you're spending on that. Those things can be pretty predictable. If you need to, it's like a big ship. It's not like you can influence it immediately. And it helps if, obviously, it not helps. It's great if you're growing, because you can slow down headcount and then your revenue is going to, grow at a faster pace. The inflow, right, on cash, to manage cash, it's all about collections. And so you can, if you walk into a situation that maybe has like a bad DSO things, you can do operational things to increase your cash flows and actually get better at it. And you can do operational things around how you sell deals. You can change structures of deals from monthly, quarterly to annual prepays, things like that. You can structure deals so that instead of doing kind of like offline payments on physical invoice, you're all doing online, either credit card, ACH, or stuff like that. So you get much more predictable on when your cash stream is coming in. And then the trick at the end of every period is really what you pay out, right? And you need to have, as a CFO, kind of visibility into this list of AP and the capability to be able to make decisions on whether you're going to overpay or you're going to push payments a little bit, right? And that is at the end. I don't know, Ray, you can comment. At the end, I think that's the biggest lever on how to hit a cash flow number.
Yeah, I mean, there's a number of how to hit it, and then trying to understand the predictability. We were able to go into the system and run scenarios through programs. I mean, Auditoria helps us do this a little bit and say, going back, what has been our cash flow? What has been our weekly cash flow? And then looking at some of those predictors that Nick talked about of those items, and then how is that going to get impacted in the future? And then what Tyler said was correct, is that at the end, do I push a payment a few days or not? Do I pay it sooner or not? I never really pay any payments sooner than I have to. I'm a finance guy, right? But maybe I would need to push it a day or two. Again, we've been lucky in this pandemic. We've actually, our growth has accelerated based upon the products that we have, that people had to go to home and work from home. And our product is a sort of a call center product that enables people to work from home in a call center. So that helped us. We were, I guess, blessed or lucky to be in the right place. But yeah, you have to do that analysis. You have to run those models in order to help you get that cash performance done. There's software tools that enable you to get that done for you. Better than Excel. Excel's good, as we all know in the finance area. That's our best tool that we have, but there's some things that could be more automated and be able to push it. We watch it every week. We do these exercise every Monday.
Yeah, like I've got an opinion about Excel, which is Excel is kind of like duct tape. It's got 1,000 uses and nobody uses it for what it was intended for. So and despite the fact that people have predicted the demise of Excel for many, many years, it's not going away. It's like the #1 tool for finance people.
Yeah.
But you mentioned something earlier, Ray, about you don't pay bills early, but don't some vendors give an incentive? Like if you pay 10 days early, you get a small discount. If you pay 20 days early, you get a different discount. Do you have to factor in those kind of early, like prepaid discounts versus the what you could do with that cash if you held on to it?
Yeah, I mean, there's actually not as many of those in the industry as you would think, but there are some, and you can just run the numbers to say, okay, if I get a 5% discount or a 2% discount or 1%, am I making money or not? So the money we make on our money is not very much these days. We're very conservative in what we do with the cash on hand. It's not like we go out and invest in GameStop. So we preserve it. So sometimes those make sense.
It does feel like that's more of an old school thing, right? The 2 net 10 kind of thing. But you probably, unless that is a very post negotiation thing, once you decide to buy, the idea is, okay, get that extra 5% on what you pay in the first place, right?
Yeah.
And to Nick, what you said, like on the AR, like the collections part, that is the hardest, right? Because you can control your out. It's really getting to predictability, as Ray said, like running these forecasts and getting out, but also decreasing any friction. Like Excel is not, it doesn't do anything for you except help you track stuff, right? But when I was talking about how do you change the way you collect, like those are things like operationally you can do. And then the question is, eventually you get to a baseline, you need to maintain it, right?
Yeah, on the collection side, Tyler made a good point. On the collection side, we tightened things down. We all of a sudden got more communication with our customers. Maybe we want to, if we have a 30-day payment, they have a 30-day payment term with us. Maybe we don't contact them till they're 5 days overdue. Now we're contacting them 5 days before it's due and saying, hey, your bill's coming up. Any questions, any issues for you? We expect payment in the next 5 days. So those communications and tightening there happen a lot more than we ever had before.
Yeah. And let me ask you guys just a related question on that. How much of that is process driven and how much of that is technology driven? Like, is there an advantage, I would assume, to just, rather than running these processes all the time, just have the technology say, look, we want a customer contacted 5 days in advance, or we don't want to pay until the very last day. Like how are you thinking about those fundamental changes where finance has traditionally been very headcount heavy and is, but now, technology and the buzzword of AI, like all of these automated decisioning and tools are coming into play where it can change the game and the efficiency at which you run the business.
Yeah, so on the AR side, we actually did the first part manual. We just said, hey, we got to go. We got to get in front of this thing. You guys got to, grind it a little bit to get this done. And then we, at the same time, using technology to say, okay, how are we going to send out our statements to customers? How are we going to ensure that they know that they owe us money and they're 2 days overdue or 5 days before they're due? And so we were able to program some things in the back end, but it did take us a few weeks to get that done. And so we had to do the manual process first.
Yeah, I think it's hard. If you really think about what happened, like the collections and payables, you often have like almost like a shared service, right? You can easily build up a huge group that is not necessarily like, they're usually a lot of junior people because it's very task oriented. And then COVID, as you can imagine, like that group is no longer working in like, you know, a war room where they're all kind of going through stuff and sharing and being managed really carefully. Now they're all in their homes, right, with a computer in front of them. If there's no technology there, then they are living like in this Excel world or some random AR system that they have. The capability to actually provide automation there, Surinder, to your point, is huge, right? So that you actually can create this dunning process that actually just happens. And I do believe that now, okay, that's the future, right? Because the technology is there now. Why would you ever hire up these big groups anymore if you can eliminate that?
Yeah, that's right. So it's not only a matter of task execution and, you know, eliminating the routine, mundane, repetitive tasks that back office people do in AR, but also having visibility. Like, for example, you know when people are late, but if you can a collections person tell that somebody is normally paying their bill 15 days early, but now they're only paying their bill 5 days early. They're not late, they're not in arrears, but they're starting to narrow that window in which they're paying early. Algorithms, specifically AI-based algorithms, can monitor and detect those things and surface those up to the collections team to help give them visibility, but then also kind of increase the velocity. Let's switch over real quick to risk, and this is something that, Surinder, I think you think about all the time as a equity research analyst. What, in your opinion, given where we're at right now, what are some of the most significant risks facing organizations today?
So I think this ties in a little bit to some of the earlier questions around, the predictability of revenues and stuff, and how we think about right now expectations are just really high, right? As somebody that's in the public markets, and we're always out there evaluating, well, what are these guys doing and what should we expect from these guys? The biggest risk from us is just misexecution, right? We always start with the top line, which is, are they going to hit the top line numbers, and what are they actually doing to hit that top line? And so from our perspective, obviously the most important thing is the predictability part of it. But then to get to the predictability and, to what Tyler and Ray were talking about earlier, it's about making sure that operationally your processes are sound. And so that's kind of where we see a lot of the risk when we think about, at least from an investor's perspective, right? At the end of the day, when there's, you have to be able to deliver for your customers. And so that falls into the equation of the customers that you're bringing in the door and versus the delivery that you're able to do. And then ultimately it's an operational question, and it varies by industry, it varies by company. And so I think, if we want to kind of dig into the details of it, it's a bit of an example by example discussion.
Ray, same question. What do you think? What are the big risks that companies are facing today?
Well, so I think the biggest risk we have that's happening that it's hard to make a decision on, no one really wants to be first, is when do you go back into the office? When does the team get back together into these into collective groups? Everyone's sort of scared to do that, because if they do it, what happens if all of a sudden 3 or 4 people get COVID, and what happens if someone gets really sick bad with it? And so I think that's the biggest risk. And with our employees, they're like, okay, when are we going to go back in the office? That's always what they want to know. We're like, hey, we have no idea. I mean, we'll probably give you a month a head start on it, but right now it doesn't look promising for the next number of months. So that's that one. And then the second part is, we sell to businesses. And so now our businesses slowing down initiatives that they have within their company. Are they willing to spend money to have technology to, granted, we believe, and we have studies that say our technology can save them money or make them more money, but they still have to go through the process of these projects of converting over, and do they really want to do it when everyone's working from home? And I think in the beginning, people were shying away from that stuff. A few of them had to do it fast because they didn't have a plan A, plan B, and so they had to do something. And now we're sort of seeing that this is sort of like be called a new normal. I know you didn't want to say that, but that this working from home is sort of a new thing. I mean, it's normal thing now. So people are starting to open back up on the business side and doing projects that help their company, help their employees be more efficient with the technology that we sell. So we're glad about that, but still a little tough process to sell.
So
Yeah.
Tyler and Ray, just for me to just kind of interject here. So when I think about risk, like to build on a little bit about what you said, one of the things that we think about is the transformation of business models, right? Because there was pre-COVID, the way that you did business, and now there's post-COVID. And part of that journey is, you alluded to it in terms of projects and technology. That's where we see the biggest risk. And can you talk about the decisions around the pace at which you're willing to adopt technology, change your business model to be, all of a sudden we used to fly around. Well, now we have, we do meetings on Zoom in order to basically build our pipeline versus the conferences the way that they were before. So there's all of these fundamental changes, delivery, work from home. How are you guys handling those transformation changes? Because when I look at the consulting world, the Accentures of the world and the business, like, they're expecting just massive amounts of business coming down the pipeline. And all of it is about changing the internal operations as well as the go-to market model for businesses. And to us, I mean, operationally, that's kind of where a lot of our questions and our focus is. And it'd be helpful if you guys can kind of address the way that you guys think about the pace of change and your willingness to adopt technology.
Yeah, Ray kind of mentioned it. Like the one of the biggest risks is the way you work, right? It's like, so when are we getting back in the office? But that's an indication of like trying to get back to the way we were, because the engagement of how things were done, right? So if you like, how did our accounting group close the books? How did our engineers develop, right? Were they used to going into war rooms and having a very collaborative process? And then what I think is one of the biggest is like, how do you sell? Right, which is the inverse surrender of what you said. How do you adopt technology? But how do you buy technology and think about that? I also think there's huge operating business model risk in relying on data from a pre-COVID world. So think about data of like, how long does it take a sales rep to ramp? Right. Well, in the old world, they all would come in, and the SDR and the SC and the rep, they'd be with their manager, they'd be on calls together, maybe using some technology, and they're all, in the same spot. Well, now without all that, is it going to take them an extra couple months to really figure out how to sell this product, what the product does, how to build their pipeline? And if you don't adjust all of these metrics because you're relying on stuff that happened pre, you could be way off, right? Internally, how you operate is like, okay, now, you got to rely on systems and software that's going to allow you to, try to get your employees to be as productive internally working from home as they were, working in an office, right? And for us, like, we have, thankfully, some tailwinds. If you think about our fresh service product, it's an ITSM product that, huge opportunity in that kind of that mid-market space for companies who maybe were very office centric in their IT departments. Like, you walk up to the IT desk and you need your computer fixed, you do that, or you have a ticketing system that's very internal based, and now you need something that is going to be fully digital and remote, right? Secondarily, you still may not be able to hire that many people, so you have to have a lot of deflection capability, have to be able to do a lot of automation and also digital communication without human intervention. And so all of this stuff is a change to the world. I actually don't think we're going to go back. I think like people will go back to offices, but when you really think about it, if we figured out how to be productive now, like in the Bay Area, I've got a lot of employees, even on my team, they're commuting an hour plus each way pre-COVID. It's like, does it make sense to say we're going to do this again, where you're going to lose 2 hours of productivity every single day, right, to be in the office? I actually can't see it going back 100%. You're seeing some of the biggest companies, right, coming out saying, yep, we're not going to do that, right? Salesforce, it probably was a pretty big decision because they just spent a lot of money on that building. And now it's like, you know what, we're not really going to use it, And so these are big decisions for companies, but I think it probably is the way it's going to happen.
Okay. Well,
Yeah,
let's drill down on that a little bit.
I
Yeah.
would say that, this COVID thing has accelerated technology greatly.
Mhm.
I think, in our business, we've said that, whereas probably about 15% of our marketplace has been converted to the cloud already, and that gives us 85% runway that's out there. And, I think it's accelerated it by cutting that time in half. I think that if we thought that it was going to take 10 years for that conversion to happen, it's now going to be 5. It's dramatic, and across all sectors, all boards, like you said, it's happening, and so companies are going to invest in it for their employees to be more efficient and to get a better experience.
Yeah. So other thoughts on technology? This last year has been one of those things where we sort of figured it out as we went along. We made the hard choices. We retooled the back office. We retooled the front office. And so how are you thinking about like the way that technology was adopted just out of necessity? People were kind of forced to do that. And what I hear everyone on the panel saying is that it's not going to go away. People aren't just going to like shelve that technology and then suddenly invest in buying more cars to put on the road to spend more time in traffic. So and we all think about things like Zoom meetings. That thing, it's everywhere. My kids are on it. That's remote learning. But what are some other technologies? I mean, I work for an AI company. We've got a lot of finance technology and automation technology. But what are some other things that you guys are seeing that have really helped kind of smooth things over and kind of help people get through it? And we'll start with Tyler. Tyler, is there any technology that you adopted that you might want to highlight?
We use our own products, so I think those are pretty good in a world right now where what I mentioned around digital engagement, which is the way everybody engages now, and then deflection, right? For customer support, it's how do you solve how do we help our customers solve their customers' problems easily, right? Through all these different channels with a lot of automation involved, and without hopefully the need for human intervention. And it's the same in the back office, right? We already talked about like how do you automate your dunning process, right? But these are things that they're literally physical groups that were doing different processes that have handovers, right? Your billings group is different than your collections group, and they have to go talk to each other all the time. And then your collections group is different than your GL group and your revenue group. And so if you can have systems that are interlinked, but also have data coming out of that systems that allow you to get those jobs done in a much more efficient, seamless way, everybody's going to adopt them. They're like, why wouldn't you? It just makes sense.
Good.
Yeah, I think we're looking. I mean, I mentioned the AR technology. It wasn't necessarily anything necessarily new that we had to go purchase, but it was about how we use the technology that we already have. And so we're finding all kinds of ways to be more efficient with it. Even the things like Zoom meetings, like we're in today. We do stand-up meetings with people. So while we can't be in the same room, I can see everyone around at least on my computer screen. We were doing it once a day. Now we're moving it to 1 or 2 times a week type thing with that technology. It actually works out pretty well because you're able to, have this spreadsheet that your interaction with or other tools besides spreadsheets, but spreadsheets are what we use. So it becomes very efficient on how we're doing that. But we're looking at all of our financial tools and how they work for us today and what we think about how they'll work for us tomorrow and being more efficient. So we're really reopening the door on a lot of things that we're thinking about.
I mean, Ray, the GoToMeeting folks just had a shiver because you called their GoToMeeting a Zoom meeting, which is like it's become like it's like
the generic Kleenex, right? Everybody got a Kleenex.
Exactly. Yeah.
I mean, I was going to say just from my perspective, looking from the outside in, at the really big picture level, it was simply an acceleration of everything that was already going on, right?
Yeah.
Fundamentally, nothing really new got invented. Like the tools that we adopted were already in existence. And part of that is just you can't invent fast enough when something like this occurs. But at the same time, we're in an age where the pace of acceleration is changing. And so I think fundamentally what's going on is what this has forced us to do is just look at each of the business processes. And we're going, and all we can expect at this point, or can expect on a go-forward basis, is we're not going back. Think of any technology or tool that you've adopted that you've actually thrown away, right? Our digital lives are just becoming more and more digital, everything that we do. And so that is basically what's going on inside the enterprise, as far as I'm concerned, is every business process is going to be examined. Like coming down the pipeline are just an incredible number of digital tools that will automate, basic tasks, but they'll go beyond that too. Is we're getting into the world of decisioning at this point as well. So automated decisioning, where people used to look at data and then they make decisions, and we're going down, and those tools are here. And now it's just a matter of people getting comfortable with them. And this has really accelerated the pace at which people are becoming comfortable with the use of tools and technologies. And now it's a matter of budgets and getting from where we are today to where we want to be tomorrow.
Get those
correct me if I'm wrong.
budget money.
So correct me if I'm wrong, but it also plays into the valuations that you're seeing, right? There's a recognition that these companies, software companies in particular, with recurring revenue models, are sustainable, but their growth is potentially going to continue to be fueled because of these transformations, right?
Oh, absolutely. That we are, there's this big compression in the timeline for them to realize value, and that's why, for the first time we saw the concept of the K-shaped recovery, right? Which is the guys that kind of did the business the old way. Well, their prospects are kind of going like this, but the guys that are doing, the business the new way, they're kind of going like this. And yeah, absolutely. This is, if you're not in technology, or if you've got kids and they're young kids, put them into computer science. That's where it is. Everything is going that way.
Yeah, you could even see it at the fast food restaurants, the ones that even put technology out, got their tablets out and started taking orders 5 cars deep. They were producing just massive amounts, and those that just went with that standard, whatever the intercom was that you talked at, there was like, it was crazy.
Yeah. It's just, this is this is where we're at, and it's only going to pick up pace. The pace is going to. Totally agree.
Yeah, I'm not saying it very articulately, but there's something about a crisis that actually pushes technology, pushes innovation. When our backs are against the wall, that's when people get creative, and that's when we see. I think we're going to look back at this period and say it was a time of just explosive creativity and innovation, and which, like as you rightly said, Surinder, is that we're never going to go back. So in the last minute or so, what I'd just like to do rapid fire right on the table, starting. I guess we'll go with. Who are you go with first on this one? Let's go with Ray first. What's gonna return to normal, and what never will?
I don't think anything will. I think it's all changed. I think it's all changed. I think that there will be people working in an office again. I think it'll be a hybrid approach. I think Tyler said that. That's probably about the closest thing that will return to normal that we have. Hopefully, we won't have to be wearing masks every time we go outside the house. So hopefully that will return to normal. But the technology that we use is accelerating. We're going to accelerate the use of it too as well. So I think that's where I would think about that.
Cool, Tyler. What's going to return to normal, and what never will?
I kind of agree. So what never will is, I don't think we're going to go back to everybody has an office, everybody goes in. I think the companies who kind of did this first, like Elastic and GitHub and these guys who never had offices, they're like, they're the ones that are right now saying, well, we called it, guys, you should have listened. But what will go back to a little bit normal, I don't know about you guys, but I think the feedback we get internally from all of our employees is that because of the Zoom world, you actually are on all the time, right? And you end up being potentially working a lot more, but not necessarily as productive, a lot of meetings, things like that. And I think folks will figure it out, right? And you'll have to figure out more of the daily cadence of what a work schedule looks like, because it's not really sustainable for work-life balance and things like that. And so as things open up externally and life goes back to normal in terms of going out. And I think it's important. I think human interaction is important. So I think business lunches, maybe some travel, right? Things like that. I do think there will be some normalcy there. I don't think the in-office thing will go back to normal.
For sure. Surinder, you get the last word.
I would say me going to my favorite restaurant is probably going to be the first thing that returns to normal. But all jokes aside, I mean, I think that the concept of normal, I think from my perspective, it's also important to illustrate that it's relative, right? So what was normal pre-COVID, while what we're doing now is not normal, right? If we were to fast forward 10 years, what we're doing today probably would be normal, right? Because think about the way that you conducted business 10 years ago and the way that you lived your life, before the smartphone, right? And then think about the 10 years prior to that. And so what's happening is it's the normal baseline is actually constantly changing. And all that's happened is we've kind of moved forward 10 years. But I think there's going to be a slow progression, but to the point that everybody else is making, we're not really going to go back. Some instinctual stuff will, but that's about it. We're social creatures, and so that part of it will be a little bit normal, but there's business travel is not going to return to the same levels, right? It's too inefficient.
So I think that's all the time we've got for today. I would like to thank my panelists, Ray Langham, Tyler Sloat, and Surinder Thind, for joining us today. This has been an intriguing conversation. I hope you all enjoyed it. I'll hand it back to Ty, and I hope you all enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks so much.
Thanks for having us.
Here, guys. Thanks, Nick.
Thanks, Nick.
Thanks, Ray. Thanks, Tyler.
Thank you all. And on behalf of CFO Daily News, I would also like to thank everyone for attending the webinar. This concludes our program.